If a man has suffered sexualized torture, he may not want to report the crime in order not to question his masculinity, which is quite traditional in our Ukrainian patriarchal society.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet. We wanted to look at how the investigation and prosecution of sexual violence is going in Ukraine, but let's set a bit of a background first.
Well, I did a little bit of research here. So, according to the United Nations, the number and the consistent reports of sexual violence and rape in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine suggest, quote, a widespread and systematic pattern committed by Russian forces there, close quote.
The Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine also said that they have received, quote, allegations of rape, including gang rape, attempted rape, forced nudity, threats of sexual violence against civilian women and girls, men and boys, end quote.
And they say they've noticed a pattern of sexual violence across Ukraine, including in the Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Kyiv, Mykolaiv and Vinnytsia Oblast. Apologies for my pronunciation, which I'm sure is not perfect.
So that is acknowledged by the UN Monitoring Commission. I found it extremely difficult to report on. We've had lots of reports. There's very few things you can check, and it's obviously extremely hard to get people to talk. And as a journalist, I'm also quite conscious of you have to be careful of re-traumatization. And when people do talk to you, and we do get people speaking to the media, there is a lot of verification and checking of the story on our part. For Reuters, it's quite stringent. So a lot of the reporting I've been involved in simply didn't pass all the checks or wasn't able to be reported out. Of course, that's not to say it's not true, but we know that the nature of conflict-related sexual violence, it's very personal and it happens behind closed doors. And a lot of rules that Reuters has on getting multiple sources to confirm an incident makes it an extremely tough beat to report on.
Well, to help us by providing some insights right now, we have two guests from Ukraine. We have Anna Sosonska. I hope that I'm saying your name correctly, Anna. She's a prosecutor and she's the acting head of the CRSV division in Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General. Hi, Anna.
Hello, from Ukraine, from Kyiv.
Thank you so much for joining us. And you also have a colleague with you, Anastasiia Moiseieva, the deputy team lead of the Global Rights Compliance CRSV team. Hi, Anastasiia.
Hi. Thank you for the invitation.
So we've explained from our perspective what makes it a little bit difficult to report on as the media, and we know that's not the most important element here at all. So let's turn it over to you and say, what makes it difficult to investigate? Anna, is it getting access to people because we're talking about some of these Russian-occupied areas, or is it the continued stigma that people feel when they've experienced these? Where would you say your biggest problems lie with investigations?
Thank you for this very important question. And indeed, Prosecutor General Office in Ukraine faces several obstacles, and I have to say so. Maybe the biggest obstacle is detecting and documenting conflict-related sexual violence crimes here in Ukraine is a very fact of mass commission of such crimes in the territory, not under the control of the Ukrainian government, in occupied territories, in place of deprivation of liberty, so-called is known as torture chambers. These crimes can be detected and documented only after the occupation of the territory by working directly with the civilian population. And those, I have to say, several years may pass from the moment of the crime to the moment of the occupation that territory. And this makes the process of information gathering and also documentation this fact very difficult. And also, I have to say that another possible way of documenting such crimes, if they are committed against Ukrainian prisoners of war, is the direct interview of prisoners of war after their exchange from the occupied territories, from the detention place, or even from the territories of the Russian Federation. And if such an exchange is agreed to by the Russian Federation, but such exchanges take place extremely rarely due to the reluctance of the Russian Federation to grant official permission for the exchange of prisoners of war. And of course, another challenge is the very fact of the reluctance to report CRSV by a person who suffered as a result of such a crime. There are several factors of such reluctance. The person doesn't feel safe, is not in a protected environment. For example, lives in a territory that also deoccupied and close to the line of combat clashes, stigmatization and condemnation by society. For example, if a man has suffered sexualized torture, he may not want to report the crime in order not to question his masculinity, which is quite traditional in our Ukrainian patriarchal society. And third point, a person's fear of testifying officially before law enforcement agency, fear of being re-traumatized by prosecutors and investigations due to improper handling of the injured person.
You say that there are all these challenges. A lot happens in the occupied territories. People have stigma. People are also concerned. They're not in a safe place to testify, and they're concerned about re-traumatization. What are the latest figures then on investigations and number of cases? What can you tell us about how many cases you're looking into?
Now I can tell you about not cases, but facts. And I have to say that now prosecutors from my division have been prosecuting 293 facts of conflict-related sexual violence committed against a male victim, women, and also both type of victims, civilians and Ukrainian POWs.
Anastasia, you are part of a team that kind of helps Ukrainian prosecutors with how to deal with this type of conflict-related sexual violence evidence. Do you see the same kind of barriers that Anna described, and how are you helping Ukrainian prosecutors to look at this evidence and these potential witnesses and victims?
Indeed, I think that the lack of access to occupied territories or to POWs who are still in Russian captivity is one of the key challenges, but also stigma, fear, or feeling of humiliation are also very considerable challenges. And I think that it may be very challenging for investigators and prosecutors to be able to recognize that a victim suffered conflict-related sexual violence. This is because due to these challenges, fear, stigma, feeling of humiliation, this is especially relevant for male victims of CRSV, and therefore it's very important that they are able to recognize the red flags of conflict-related sexual violence. These are different indicators, maybe specific expressions or body language that shows that a person might suffer conflict-related sexual violence. And we at Global Rights Compliance, we are cognizant of that. And because of this, as part of our effort to strengthen the law enforcement capacity to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence, we provide information during our training about these red flags, like red flags in general, but also red flags which we encountered in the Ukrainian context.
You're one part of this bigger machine that we see only from outside of a number of different accountability actors who are all trying to help the Prosecutor General's office or maybe conduct other investigations. You've already mentioned that coordination issue, Anna. How do you deal with that when it comes to trying to protect the individual victims from getting questioned again and again?
What do we do to prevent re-traumatization of victims? Yeah, Anastasiia has mentioned about a special workshops, special trainings that different non-government organizations and also different international organizations provide for Ukrainian prosecutors, for Ukrainian investigators. And also I have to say that since the full-scale invasion started, there has indeed been a considerable increase in justice actors working in Ukraine, from local level to international organization, aid agencies, like different type of actors. And we've been concerned about the possibility of survivors being interviewed numerous times by different actors, not only by prosecutors and investigators who conduct directly pretrial investigation. To address this, Office of the Prosecutor General has managed to centralize CRSV cases within the CRSV division, which is my division where I've worked in. And because of the Ukrainian legislation, oversees the investigation conducted by regional prosecutors. These coordination efforts have certainly helped in preventing victims from being subjected to multiple interviews and interaction with law enforcement agencies.
And indeed, as part of our training, we talk a lot about risks of re-traumatization and how the number of victim interviews should be limited. And we talk about how other types of evidence can be used to substantiate the information to support the case.
And also, if I may add just a point to my previous highlight, I want to stress the great willingness, to be honest, of the international organization to collaborate with Ukrainian law enforcement agency and with a local non-government organization, the various actors. We work closely with the Office of CRSG Pramila Patten and her team of experts on rule of law in context of sexual violence in armed conflict. And now, because of the multiplicity of actors on the ground, the Office of the Prosecutor General is striving to coordinate efforts so that the survivors seek legal resources through the Ukrainian legal system and reduce the number of actors that will interview them. That is why we also, Prosecutor General Office, my division, we work directly with human rights monitoring mission here in Ukraine, and we are really willing to disclose on legal way, of course, material of our investigation to be verified by the really well-known international organization.
There was some reporting done by the UN Commission of Inquiry in quite horrific details. They are talking about rapes being committed against people of very different ages. They mention a case of a 4-year-old girl that happened near Kiev in March 2022. And if you don't like listening to this kind of stuff, now is the time to kind of mute your podcast for a couple of seconds. There are reports of 2 Russian soldiers entering a house where they raped both a 22-year-old woman and her husband several times, forced them to have sexual intercourse in front of them, and one of the soldiers then forced their 4-year-old daughter to perform oral sex on him. And at the end of the age scale, there are cases of women over 80 being raped in Chernihiv. Are those reports the same as you're hearing? Is that a very extreme case, or is that... I mean, it is a very extreme case. Is it a one of a kind, or are you have a coordinating role, you see all of the stories? Is this representative of what is happening?
Yes, we also investigate the same facts with the same perpetrators, and we also work directly with victims who suffered from such crimes. And there is not a secret because our Prosecutor General also told about 4 years girl who suffered from conflict-related sexual violence, and about this lady that you has mentioned in age, like 83 years old, and she was raped by Russian soldiers. So yes, there's not a secret, and indeed this is so. There is still some myth surrounding conflict-related sexual violence that is main target young women, and however the reality is that there are no exceptions in categories of victim in terms of age, in terms of gender, socio-economic backgrounds, among other considerations. Within Russia's invasion to Ukraine, people of all walk of life, women, men, underaged, elderly, have been subjected to sexual violence. In this point, it is important to note that conflict-related sexual violence is commonly used as a weapon of war, and it is likely used by Russian armed force, which implies that the perpetrators will use it against anyone that deem appropriate for their objectives. According to what we have seen so far in our investigations, it is likely that CRSV is being used as a weapon of war in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the CRSV division of the Prosecutor General Office has recorded sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers against victims as young as you mentioned, 4 years old. In total, there are currently 15 facts of CRSV committed against underaged, 14 facts of CRSV committed against girl, and 1 against boy, which are being investigated and prosecuted here in Ukraine. And also, I have to say that, as you have mentioned before, CRSV has also been committed against elderly people. For instance, we recorded CRSV committed against 83 years old woman. And this again goes to show that sexual violence in Ukraine is being committed against survivors that belong to different age and different gender groups that found themselves in occupied territory. So, however, some Ukrainians have been targeted specifically because of their social standing and their pro-Ukrainian views as well.
You say specifically that you think that conflict-related sexual violence is or has been used as a weapon of war, essentially as a military tactic. But are these small, random examples, or can you connect the dots and say that this is actually a pattern? And I suppose then the question will be, can you link it back up the chain of command?
Yeah, so let me say clearly, yes, during the 10th year that Russia has been at war against Ukraine, indeed, we see that Russian armed forces have been wielded sexual violence and threat of sexual violence as a tool of war and a tool for occupation as well. It is a tactic of subjugation, of psychological terror, of control, of coercion, and it is integral to the execution of their plans in Ukrainian territories. And I have to say also that Russians' bloody aggression against Ukraine and Ukrainians, which target civilians at will and at random, and frequently violates the laws of war against our soldiers, enshrines CRSV as a tool of psychological terror and control to erode Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian nation. So in all territories occupied by Russian armed force since the moment of war happened in 2014, sexual violence is applied equally to both women and men, and this is an indicators that CRSV is part of Russian policy of aggression, under which the gender, age, or status of the victim do not matter. And Russians commit these crimes against anyone who considers himself Ukrainian. And in the occupied territories, which is also, I have to highlight, the most proactive parts of the Ukrainian population, politicians, political activists, journalists, also religious leaders, former servicemen of police and former servicemen of Ukrainian armed forces, member of territorial defense, have been systematically detained and subjected to the most horrific acts, including sexual violence. On the other hand, sexual violence is also being committed against Ukrainian POWs, as well as mothers, wives, sisters of the military, of the Ukrainian servicemen. And we discovered that fact when some territories on Kherson region and Mykolaiv region were deoccupied. We discovered the fact that Russian really used this sexual violence, against family members of Ukrainian servicemen as a weapon to provide aggressive war against Ukrainian and just to suppress our willingness to fight against Russia.
And we also have evidence of sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers being approved and rewarded by the Russian authorities. Back in April 2022, the whole world was shocked by the crimes such as extrajudicial killings, torture and sexual violence uncovered in Bucha. And what was Russia's response? The military unit which is responsible for committing those acts was rewarded by the Russian President Putin for bravery and courage, and the head of that military unit was promoted to a rank of a colonel and awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation award. And if we are looking at some specific acts of sexual violence, what we see is that genital electrocution has been prevalent in all the areas under Russia's control. And this type of sexual violence, it's not an opportunistic violence. At the very least, you need to have special equipment to be able to apply such kind of violence. And we see the same pattern, the same type of sexual violence in all these areas. So it's also another indication of how Russia has been weaponizing sexual violence against Ukraine and Ukrainian population.
When you have this description of this sexual violence as intended in some way against the identity of Ukrainians, it starts to make me wonder whether you are considering not only war crimes, not only crimes against humanity, but also potentially genocide charges.
I think so, yeah. It looks like we really try to gather as much evidence as we can just to prove a potential case of genocide.
To both of you, we've talked about this. You talked about this specific kind of sexualized torture that goes on. We've had CRSV experts on our podcast in the past who said that with men, you kind of see a pattern where it gets prosecuted as torture, they describe it as torture, and they don't really want to admit the sexualized component of it. Do you see the same thing in Ukraine? Are you trying to prosecute it really as CRSV? And is the police and other law enforcement, are they enough equipped to recognize these kind of things when somebody describes torture to kind of, I don't know, do you nudge somebody to explain more of what happened, or, how do you get somebody to talk about this?
Yes, I think that we have a similar situation in Ukraine. Sometimes it is indeed the case that for many victims of sexualized torture, victims are more eager to disclose the fact of torture than the sexual element of torture. So sometimes we see in the protocols we review that victims describe how they were subjected to electrocution or beating over all body parts without specifically indicating which body parts. So indeed, this is something which is peculiar for the situation in Ukraine. And last year, global rights compliance was requested by the Office of the Prosecutor General to help the Kherson Regional Prosecution Office with reviewing the case files about the mistreatment of Ukrainians in places of detention in occupied Kherson. So as part of this work, we've uncovered that around 45% of men in those places of detention were subjected to torture, including sexual torture. And we've also uncovered instances of a Russian commander ordering genital electrocution of 17 Ukrainian male detainees. And we know that the indictment against this commander has been sent to the court. But answering your second part of the question about whether the police is trained to discover the sexual element of torture, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, during our training, we focus a lot on red flags of CRSV, red flags in general, red flags in the Ukrainian context, red flags from women and men, and they cover a wide array of indicators, expressions, body language, some medical conditions the victims of unlawful confinement may experience. So we try to strengthen the law enforcement capacity to be able to identify the sexual element of torture.
Yeah, and also if I may add, because, there's a very core question from you. If prosecutors and investigators are able to recognize CRSV as CRSV, not just like a type of general war crime, if I may say. So that is why we asked our partners from non-government organization, Global Rights Compliance, to provide a special dedicated trainings on different techniques of interviewing to Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators on regional level, and we are very pleased they have done it. So actually also our specialized division here in the Office of the Prosecutor General is coordinating with different actors, in particular, as I have already mentioned, Pramila Patton's team of experts, if we are talking about our main core counterparts, to provide frequent and tailored trainings to law enforcement personnel, not only police officers or investigators and prosecutors who are dealing with war crimes and conflict-related sexual violence, but as well as judges on interviewing victims of sexual violence with a victim-centered approaches, and on how international law contribute to this investigation pursuant to Ukrainian law, on how trauma affects witnesses and their ability to provide testimony, different technique. So that is why we are very excited that different actors, non-government organization, Ukrainian, international organization, are really willing to help a Ukrainian law enforcement agency and Prosecutor General Office in that.
And can you outline what the plans are for prosecution? Do you have some kind of a technical term, a roadmap ahead? I understand that the first rape trial was held in December 2022. What do you see coming up?
I wish you were here in my office and, because in that case, you would be able to see different maps on my wall, and there's a very tricky question about mapping of CRSV, because indeed there's actually what we are doing here in the Office of the Prosecutor General, but don't tell about it. There is a very, secret here. Of course, there is a joke. As of today, notices of suspicion have been issued against 42 Russian servicemen suspected on having committed CRSV. And I have to say that also about some result of our previous work, because my division was set up in September 2022, and we have done a lot of different work. So Also, we have 19 indictments against 28 Russian servicemen were sent to court. One of the recent indictments concerned the mistreatment of civilians in detention place in the occupied territories. Anastasiia has mentioned about that. And also 4 individuals were already sentenced by the Ukrainian courts to prison term ranging between 10 and 12 years. This recent decision were issued by the court in Kyiv and Kherson regions. Both concerned rape and other form of ill treatment committed against female civilians residents in occupied territories. But also I'd like to disclose a little bit information about our plan, because you asked me about that. In terms of our plans, one of our main goals is to investigate and prosecute CRSV holistically, not just focusing on a direct perpetrator, on a separate incidents of sexual violence, but building bigger, more comprehensive cases, looking into patterns of sexual violence across all the affected regions, or investigating patterns of sexual violence in the different detention places under Russian control. This would allow us to build cases not just against direct perpetrators, as I indicated, but also against mid and high-level commanders in Russian armed force. And in parallel, we are working on implementing a case management system here in the Prosecutor General Office and a special database of conflict-related sexual violence cases to start build macro cases to start targeting suspects beyond the foot soldiers.
If you are saying that you are looking not only for direct perpetrators, but middle and higher up people, does that mean that you're also sharing evidence with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, who will be obviously going for the highest perpetrators? How does that work?
I won't tell you about the accurate proceeding, because there is some classified information that I'm not in the position to share with. But there is not a secret that because the Prosecutor General, Mr. Andrei Kostin, has already mentioned about our cooperation with different international organizations as well as International Criminal Court. And that International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants. Yeah, the cooperation exists, remains, and we try to do all our best.
And of course, prosecution is extremely important of sexual and gender-based violence. But one of the other things we always hear a lot about are reparations. And we have your First Lady, who is very much behind the initiative for reparation payments. Up to 500 Ukrainian survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are at the moment being identified and awarded interim reparations, including financial, medical, and psychological support. What difference does it make to have these reparations also in your work? I mean, I understand what difference it makes to the survivors, but does it help your work as well, these reparations initiatives?
The first thing that I would like to highlight, so for me, as for prosecutors, that would be really useful if all victims, not only those who suffered from conflict-related sexual violence, would receive some kind of reparations, compensations. But of course, that, there is a great moment that we have this initiative because of ongoing conflict. The conflict is still ongoing between Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, there's a great procedures and a lot of work to be done. And the reparation issue demonstrates Ukraine's clear commitment to ensure that its domestic laws are in conformity with international law and standards relevant to reparation. For us, it also shows that Ukraine is attempting to be not only in conformity with international standards, but also to play a leadership role in terms of responding to the need of victims of CRSV, because it is very vulnerable victim. They are very sensitive because of the type of war crimes that they suffered from. To date, interim reparation programs have been put in place only in post-conflict settings, recommended or ordered by truth commissions or included in peace agreements. By introducing this legislation now, amidst ongoing conflict, as was mentioned before, Ukraine is significantly increasing the likelihood that interim reparations can make meaningful differences in the lives of CRSV survivors and their family members, and actually result in avoiding irreparable harm that it too often caused by the passage of time from when the harms originally occurred. It also paves the way for establishing a comprehensive reparation program to all victims of conflict-related sexual violence. So we'll live and see how everything will go.
I agree. I think that all the reparation initiatives are very welcomed. It's also one of the ways for the Ukrainian government, for the international community to show the victims that their suffering is recognized by the Ukrainian authorities, but also by the community in general. But it is also very important to ensure that such reparations are not limited to one-time payment. It is necessary to ensure indeed that reparations cover a number of services, a number of programs. It may be a financial compensation, but it should also be medical services, psychological assistance, etc.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time out of your super busy schedules and super important work to come and talk to us. We usually ask you at the end, is there something that we didn't ask you or that we didn't pay attention to in relation to what we were talking about CRSV, that you really want people to know and that you want the chance to tell our listeners? Then please take that opportunity now.
Well, I would like to say that since 2022, there has been an increase in support for justice efforts in Ukraine, and we are deeply grateful for this. But it's also very important for support to continue, because as many people involved in investigating and prosecuting international crimes know, justice takes time. And this is especially relevant for investigating and prosecuting conflict-related sexual violence, where victims may need time to process their traumas.
Yes. And from my side, I just want to say that, you asked me about everything related directly to the work of Prosecutor General Office, to the special policies that we use in our work. And the only one thing that I would like to highlight there is the support of Ukraine and Ukrainians, and how important this is for us because of ongoing war and because of a new wave of counteroffensive on Ukraine in Kharkiv region. That is very important. And I would like to say for everyone who will hear us, just think about the war that is not too far from you and from your place of residence. War is everywhere. Not only in Ukraine, in Israel, or somewhere. War, if it is happened, it will happen again. Just remember about that.
We always end our podcast with kind of questions you can't prepare for. So this is going to be a bit of a curveball maybe. But we are a bunch of legal nerds on this podcast. And so we always ask our guests, do you have a favorite court case that you worked on or that you know about or that you like to tell people about, or when you're explaining to people what kind of work you do that you like to reminisce about?
So I'm not going to tell you about CRSV cases because it is predictable. Come on, for a head of the special dedicated division who are dealing with CRSV, talking about CRSV cases, even if it is international one, So the most important for me, for Ukrainian living here in Ukraine, And if we are talking about international jurisdiction, that was a court decision in MH17. Because when it happened, it was so a tragedy for all Ukrainians, despite the fact that it happened against civilians from different nationality, and not only Ukrainians suffered from that. So it was a great tragedy for us. When it happened in 2014 on a territory which was occupied by Russian and pro-Russian forces, I can't even tell you how painful it was and how painful it is. I had the ability to take a look on the final decision. And for me, it was very painful to read about testimonies of fathers, testimonies of those who lost their beloved, lost their child on that catastrophe, and realize that their pain now forever and ever will relate it to Ukraine and to Ukrainian territory. So for me, it's very painful. And that is why, like, when you asked me about the core criminal case, for me, there is MH17.
I think I can mention the Izolatia case because it's also the case which is very important for me. I did not work on it. I don't know whether you are familiar with this, but Izolatia is the name of probably the most famous detention place in occupied Donetsk. It was established back in 2014, and it's probably the most famous torture chamber. And one of the former detainees of Izolatia, Stanislav Aseyev, he is a journalist, a writer, and now he is also a defender of Ukraine. He wrote a book about it, and this book, honestly, it shocked me very much. First, I read it when I read it before I started working with conflict-related sexual violence. So those testimonies, the description of those acts of sexual violence which were committed there, and honestly, it looked like Article 7 or 8 of the Rome Statute. So basically, every imaginable kind of sexual violence happened there. And so I was deeply troubled by that book, by what Aseyev wrote there. And I think it was in 2021 where the information emerged that the head of that detention facility, Denis Kulikov, he was actually captured and brought in Kiev for trial. Mm-hmm. And this January, a first instance court decision was issued, and he was sentenced to more than 10 years of imprisonment. And I know that an appeal was submitted, but I really hope to see that he is brought to justice, because I think that it's also a very important signal to all the victims of conflict-related sexual violence that, yes, justice takes time, but even in many years, there is always a chance that a perpetrator is brought to justice.
And our final question that we ask, again, you don't have a chance to prepare for this, but is there anything that you are reading or listening to or watching, or maybe something more long-term that you would like to recommend to our audience? It can be connected to your work, or it can be what you use to get away from your work, or maybe an activity that you use to get away from things. Anastasia, you've already mentioned one book about torture. Is there something else that you would like to suggest to the audience?
Well, I'm currently reading The Internationalists by Scott Shapiro and Una Hathaway. It's about basically how the concept of war became outlawed by international law. And well, I just started recently, so I read basically just several chapters, but it's very enlightening, and it's a law book, but it's also a history book, and it's written in a very accessible manner. So I would definitely recommend it.
I just think on something that I can recommend regarding to my work directly, and probably it will be a book of unknown author. It titled Woman in Berlin. Highly recommend to read. And what about maybe movie?
I think we can both recommend watching a documentary, 20 Days in Mariupol. It was shot by a Ukrainian journalist, Mstislav Chernenko. He recently won an Oscar for it. It basically depicts how a group of journalists stayed in Mariupol during the first weeks of invasion, and it shows basically what crimes were committed there and how Russia managed to seize control over the city and what crimes were committed in the city. And I truly believe that for now it's the most important documentary about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also Russia's crimes against Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm. I just can add that, yeah, there is highly recommended to see, but me as a person who used to live in Mariupol, as all who used to live in Mariupol, I think from this moment and till every time, I will not be able to see that.
I just got the chance to see it last month where I am, and it's the most visceral documentary I have ever seen, and I agree with you to strongly recommend it. Well, thank you both very, very much for making the time to give us some insights into the work that both of you are doing in this field.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for having us.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice effort for mass violence. Music is by audionautics.com, and you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.